Good to see everyone. The traditional salutation, Warami, it's good to see you. This is in Darug, Sydney's traditional language. My name is Doru Costache. I am greeting you from the land of the Garigal, a clan of the Guringai people where I live, a land currently known as the Banjoy Peninsula. It's my pleasure to moderate this last session of the Faith and Science stream, a stream which, together with Nicola, Hoggard, Creegan, who can't be with us today, I'm organizing for the second year in a row at ANZATS. We represent the two major faith and science organizations in our countries, NZCIS in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and ISCAST in Australia, respectively. The first presenter at this final session is Dr. Hermina Nedelescu. Hermina is a neuroscientist at Scripps Research in California. Currently, she's pursuing a master's degree at the Graduate Theological Union with the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. Her paper is about addiction as a normal, hedonic, and motivating function of the neural system. Hermina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm sharing the screen because I have slides. Okay, can you see my slides? Not the notes, just the slides.
Yes, yeah, it looks good.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So perhaps the last frontier of science, its ultimate challenge is to understand the biological basis of consciousness and the mental processes by which we perceive, act, learn, and remember, all of which influence our decisions and choices. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Hermina, and today I come to you from San Diego, where I study the brain and behavior. And I'd like to talk about psychological addiction as a normal function of the human neural system. Because addictions can lead to significant disturbances or even death, my talk is centered on providing a general theory that seeks to explain both psychological addiction and some people's tendency for exposing themselves to extreme danger. In this, I will present to you what the dark side of addiction is. And what's new about my presentation, I also want to present that there is a flip side to this and that there is a light side to it. So the thesis that I'm working with is that thirsting or craving for Christ is, which craving is an addiction, but here it is a normal behavioral phenomenon of addiction provided by our brain to teach us to move toward resting at equilibrium in the eternal God. And I will show you what I mean by that. So to make sense of human obsessions or compulsions or other behaviors, I use neuroscience as a tool. And the central principle for neuroscience, for us neuroscientists, is that all behavior is a reflection of brain function. The action of the brain underlines not only simple motor behaviors such as walking, breathing, or smelling, but also complex, affective, and cognitive behaviors such as feeling, learning, thinking, and making decisions. And finally, the disorders of affect, which are disorders of feelings, and disorders of cognition, which are disorders of thought that characterize neurotic, psychotic, or compulsive illnesses such as psychological addictions, can be seen as disturbances of brain function, although I do not think that this is always the case, as I will show you in this presentation. For example, in the context of the early Christian church beginning to form, but also more recently, as in the case of Mother Maria of Paris, many of the apostles and martyrs put themselves in extreme danger as they held their intense religious convictions that a crucified criminal was the long-awaited Messiah. So one could ask, what drove these individuals to such intense craving to follow Jesus? In our modern times, intense craving to compulsively seek something one becomes dependent on despite negative consequences is the hallmark that defines addiction. So how might the theologian reconcile the experience of intense craving for Christ with craving for another human being, or even craving for heroin? The behavioral hypothesis of dependence is one that cannot be easily explained by neuroscience or theology alone. But by integrating both, I think we can have a better comprehensive understanding. The topic of addiction does not fit well into theological standard models. Theologians might therefore be excused of ignoring the topic of addiction if it were confined to brain chemistry and psychological causes, primarily concerning behaviorists or neuroscientists like myself. However, I have a growing suspicion that addiction is a more general phenomenon of the human neural system with the purpose to perceive and seek delightful experiences of what is truly beautiful. After all, is there anything more pleasurable than experiencing the magnificence of transcendent love found in the divine eternity? So today's definition of addiction is defined as a chronically relapsing brain disorder that is characterized by compulsion to seek a drug or a stimulus, because it need not be a drug, loss of control in limiting intake or engagement with this stimulus, and persistence despite negative consequences. And there's a high propensity for relapse, meaning that it never really ceases. It's never quenched. So let's take a step back and ask the question of, how does our brain know whether something is a negative consequence or not? How do our brains determine whether something is good or bad? Well, the brain has evolved multiple strategies to solve this problem at different levels. One strategy is the idea of psychological or emotional valence. We often call this hedonic valence. And what hedonic valence is and refers to is the degree to which something is pleasurable or aversive. And one of the first people to bring this forward was Richard Solomon in the 1970s. So to describe this phenomenon, I want to provide two examples for you, two made up examples, to explain the dynamics of these peaks. But essentially what it is what goes up must come down. But here's the example. First example, shortly after March 11th of 2020, when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic, a woman at home reads the news about the world shutting down and is immediately terrified. Now, this terrified or aversive stimulus is the first peak. Countries sealed their borders, sports teams canceled their games, schools closed, employees were asked to go home, and places of worship closed, and people started wearing masks and social distancing. The woman at this point is still and paces the floor. After some time, she slowly regains her composure and gets to work. At this point, she's still bothered by the terrifying news, but no longer that terrified and distracted. So now she's entering an adaptation phase. While in this stage, she calls her friends, some of whom are doctors and scientists, for an evaluation of the situation. She is frightened, still tense, and very disturbed. Her friends in the biomedical field explain safety measures to avoid getting infected with the novel respiratory virus, which includes wearing masks, avoiding crowds, or being in ventilated areas, at least until the vaccine is available. So she is now in a steady state. Several days go by, and several days later, the woman leaves her apartment wearing a mask, hesitant to go outside, but is no longer terrified. A few weeks later, she enjoys the outdoor air with a euphoric mood permeating her activities as she resumes part of her previous duties. So we have now moved from being terrified to euphoria. So this is that opposite. That's why it's called an opponent process of motivation. So it's a completely opposite sensation. Several months later, she returns to work and to her regular schedule, and her emotional behavior is back to normal equilibrium. Her euphoria is gone, and there is no sign of the earlier terrifying experience of that day in March 2020. And that's the decay of this reaction, and she now returns to equilibrium. Now, I want to provide a second example, because in the first example, I explained how the first hedonic valence was aversive, but now I want to show you how it can also be pleasurable. In the second example, 2 or 3 gather on a weekday feast and begin the divine liturgy with intense pleasure as they experience heaven on earth. That is the pleasurable peak. After 30 to 40 minutes of a constant level of delightful pleasure, the intensity of this of this pleasure decreases a little. That's the adaptation phase. Normally, this decline would elicit a calculated behavior by the faithful, characterized by more focus in order to increase the intensity of worship and maintain that high level of delight, that steady state. Perhaps at this point, the priest turns around and says, "Peace be with you," and everyone focus again. Unfortunately, in this example, at that moment, the presiding priest has a heart attack and collapses on the floor. The abandoned 2 or 3 faithful experience a quick decline of that delightful liturgical atmosphere, becoming tense, anxious, or simply frozen, and now terrified. So this is a situation where there's pleasure and then a terrifying opposite peak is formed when that stimulus of pleasure is removed. And then after a couple hours, they say the priest is unresponsive. They call the paramedics, and he becomes stabilized on the way to the hospital. So then the peak here decays, and the person regains their composure. So both of these examples that I share with you share common features. First is the introduction of that aversive stimulus that I said, the respiratory virus. And second is a pleasurable stimulus, the liturgical excitation, in which the affective or hedonic reaction begins quickly to rise to a high peak. And then there's an adaptation phase, a steady phase. And when the stimulus is gone, then there's a formation of an opposite peak. This is how we tend to respond to many things. So this opponent process that I'm explaining here is a way to correct extreme hedonic states. So these peaks, it's a way to minimize them so that we can be around the baseline. That is the idea. So here I want to show you in the context of heroin, which I study opioids. So with heroin, if you focus on the left-hand side here, when you first take heroin, you feel a euphoric rush, and then there's an adaptation phase and a steady phase until the pharmacokinetic effects of heroin is consumed in the body, and then you fall into withdrawal. Now, with multiple heroin intakes, we call this multiple stimulation, that euphoria peak is now diminished, and the person needs heroin just to feel comfortable and near his or her equilibrium. And because heroin is very temporary in the body, when that stimulus is gone, now the peak here that is opposite is much more intense than the first peak, and it's really agony and extreme withdrawal. And this is what we call the dark side of drug addiction, because there's this switch from a rewarding experience to intense craving. And the reason this is a dark side is because there's negative reinforcement going on here. And what that means is that there's a learning that takes place. And the learning that I'm talking about is that a person begins to learn that the removal of this agony with more drug provides them reward, and that is what is driving the intense craving. The withdrawal and the feeling, the withdrawal effects are not actually what is driving more craving, but it's actually that learning itself. So that's the dark side of addiction, that you get into this cycle. But I do want to show you that this is a property of ourselves as being human, and there is a light side to it. But first, let's look a little bit closer at the dynamics of this model that I'm showing you, which is called the opponent process of motivation. And not with heroin, but let's look with imprinting. So imprinting is to make a mark on something or someone, just as a newly hatched duck imprinting a mother duck, and thus follows it everywhere it goes. So in the first few stimulations, the duck feels pleasure, cessation of fear, no distress. But when the mother is gone, the small duckling will feel loneliness, distress. And this is relatively short duration. Now, over time, this little duckling will have immediate pleasure, no cries. This is very comfortable. It's its normal steady state near the equilibrium. But when the mother is gone, now that feeling of loneliness becomes much more intense. There's intense cries, and this is a much longer duration to get back to normal. So I want to present one more, and that is the case of parachutists. So when parachutists make their first jump, they are often terrified, as measured by facial expressions and autonomic responses. Upon landing, they appear stunned for several minutes before gradually regaining normal composure. Now, after parachutists jump multiple times, such as in expert people, their response is very different. And when they jump, they no longer feel terrified. So that peak of being terrified is now lower, as you can see it here. So, and after they land safely, what's important to know is that they feel exhilarated for hours. And this, so experienced parachutists like to jump because of the exuberant feeling after the jump. So they put themselves through repeated aversive stimulation in order to experience the pleasurable opposite peak, which is this intense, long-lasting, euphoria. So from this point of view, this type of apparent masochistic behavior where pleasure is gained from pain is not a mental disorder, but rather a reflection of the normal functioning of a healthy, automatic emotional control system. And from this point of view, there's nothing abnormal or strange about addiction. This is just how we go up and down around the baseline. So in the case of the martyrs that I presented earlier, they also put themselves in extreme danger as they held their intense religious convictions that Jesus was their Lord and God. They were totally dependent on Christ as Lord and God, and could anticipating such exhilaration in the life to come be the reason why many martyrs eagerly accepted their premature death. So let's move on, because Gregory of Nyssa also noticed this natural aspect of oppositeness exhibited by human beings. So in his On the Making of Man, he says, to miss anything that tends pleasure is for the brutes a matter of pain. So he understood that the removal of reward produces an opposite peak of aversive experience. He also says that man seems to be to bear a double likeness. This is the reason he gives to opposite things, being molded in the divine element of his mind to the divine beauty, but bearing in the passionate impulses that arise in him a likeness to the brute nature. So he sees people as in between, and there's this tension between the physicality and the spiritual being. I agree with Gregory of Nyssa, except that I don't think that we are innately savages or violent people, but rather that we are still growing into perfection. He also interestingly talks about the forbidden fruit not being 100% evil, but something with opposite qualities, because it is pleasant temporarily to the eyes and taste, but ultimately destroys the person once they engage with it. So there's also heroin has this duplicity whereby euphoria is felt only temporarily. So perhaps even, I'm thinking further, perhaps even human love, an attachment to another human being, may also have this duplicity. We may become attached to another person who may die before us. That's what I want to talk about next. Because the kinds of oppositeness which can be generated by this model are really remain many to be studied. It's not just heroin or imprinting. So we can look at love. So in the case of love, an immediate, you meet someone, there's excitement, and there's an adaptation phase. And when that person is gone or you're separated, then you feel lonely. And then it takes some time to get back to normal. Now, after a lot of time spending with this person, as in the case of a marriage, this excitement is now lowered and it's near just comfortable, near the baseline. But when this person, should our partner die, then we fall not into hate, but actually extreme grief. So that's the opposite. And that takes a long time to get back to normal. So what I want to say here, you know, this kind of love appears to have a duplicity or an opposite, because they, when the person is gone, we fall into grief. However, we still need each other, and being in isolation is not great for us. So I think that the love we share with others is different than a love with heroin, for example, because there's some sense of eternity there, because we are codependent on each other in a different way. I'm not explaining that well, but St. Basil the Great does a better job than me at explaining co-interdependence. He highlights that we have an inclination and impulse that human beings have towards the greatest commandment, to love. He highlights this intense longing for love toward God is not taught, but rather an innate feature of the human being. And finally, he argues that by nature, humans are desirous of beautiful things and have affection for what is close to them. What I want to point out here is that St. Basil the Great doesn't say that we are programmed to love innately. He says that we have a tendency to seek love. So we long for it. So I don't want to say it's like seeking heroin, but we have this tendency to seek love. We're not programmed immediately to love. And here I want to provide some examples from these saints that have very strong statements, and perhaps we may look at them as indicative of a serious mental disorder, because they say things like, woe is me that my sojourning is prolonged, my desires to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. My soul has thirsted for the strong and living God. Lord, now let your servant depart. So we might look this as something that's craving or dependency, and we don't necessarily think this is bad. I have just one more slide to show. So what is the point of this whole system? So we innately seek and crave rewarding things, beautiful things, I think, and St. Basil the Great seems to think, is to reach what is true and beautiful. So in this first part here, if there is a separation, most of us will fall into grief, and that provides us an opportunity and a learning to move up to a higher baseline, to move from the temporary love that we know here to a more eternal love, this love devoid of duplicity, an eternal love, a loving God. I don't think many people are able to immediately make it there. I think most of us fall into some kind of grief. And I like this model because also Saint Maximus the Confessor talks about how restless we are in life and that we're constantly moving. And this model for me is reminiscent of what he writes, that we move up and down and we will never rest until we reach rest in God. And I'm out of time, but I am looking at other models, oppositeness, for example, trust and fear, because the opposite of trust is fear, but then that provides an opportunity for faith to be moved up. And then lastly, I'm also looking at pride and its opposite, shame, because we often hide our shame with pride, but that provides an opportunity for humility. I will end. And what I have done here is I have expanded what we know about psychological addictions from my field and integrated this information in a theological framework to better understand the nature of our human nervous system and its capacity to be a driving force in love for God and love for neighbor. This opponent process theory of motivation model does not assume all hedonic disequilibrium states can cause a corrective or oppositional reaction in the brain system. It really is just a phenomenon to look at the habituation to the presence of pleasurable things and intensify grief by the absence of that which is causes the pleasure. And then the opposite, habituation to the presence of an adversive event, such as those parachutists, and intensify pleasure after the termination of the negative experience. And with that, I will end because I'm 3 minutes over. But I think it's, there I am. I think this is a model that's not perfect, and it can go haywire and we can be addicted to something bad, but I think there's potential there to move us up.
Wonderful.
Curious what you think about that.
Well, I love it. Pardon the pun. Yeah, listening to you, I was reviewing in my mind the diary of Saint Silouan the Athonite and his expressions of angst and terror at the prospect of losing the presence of the Holy Spirit, and there's expressions there of you know, that everyone who reads that gets it. It's like, you know, the guy was addicted to the Spirit's presence, and yeah. So there are ways and ways in which we can address this topic, but let me stop rambling and let's invite the floor. Any comments or questions to Hermina? Okay, there you have it. Ty.
Sorry, messing with my headset there. I actually have a background in drug and alcohol, so this is a really interesting paper, and I can remember about 30 years ago being at a drug and alcohol conference and somebody having this amazing display with Robert Palmer singing, you know, Addicted to Love, and all these advertisements kind of popping up. Playing into that addiction to love, right? That we want to be loved, or we want to have pleasurable experiences and all of that. So there's a real resonance there with kind of my past self. So thank you for this investigation. And I guess what I was just kind of interested in was you used examples of kind of in the moment, small, quick situations, jumping out of a plane. And then long-term situations of living a life married, and then the long-term grief after that. So there's this temporality that I'm interested in, you just maybe mentioning a little more. And just the example of being in church and having a delightful experience, and then the minister dropping dead, which is, I hope, a made-up situation.
I made it to show the model.
Good. What would be the sequel, if they hadn't dropped dead? If it's simply a really beautiful, wonderful experience, and then we hope to, you know, replicate that week after week or morning after morning. You know, how does that play out? Do I get kind of sad, you know, by Wednesday or something, or is there some sort of different? Is there a different graph, I guess, in that sort of circumstance? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think in that case, if you had this rewarding experience, you will seek it again. You will seek it again at some point. If not the next Sunday, then the following Sunday, because we tend to seek these rewarding experience. They're also associated with release in certain neurochemicals that make us feel good. And when that stimulus is gone, we simply seek it again. Yeah, I think you would really enjoy rereading, you might have known, but the paper by Richard Solomon, and together with your background in substance use disorders, I think you might enjoy going back there, because I'm integrating a lot of his ideas here.
Yeah, and it's great. It's as you sort of indicated at the start, it's an area that's been under examined. So well done, you. Thank you.
Great, Hermina. Any other comments or questions? I'd like to add one more comment. You also reminded me of something that I read in a very popular book by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, The Human Phenomenon, whatever it's translated in English. And he speaks of love as a driving force of all life. And I think you are onto something very important. I mean, of course, there are strange ways of manifesting love, but love is still something that pertains to to the nature of the universe, and from my viewpoint, marks the or whatever bears the mark of a loving God, loving Creator, and this kind of attitude, loving attitude, goes across the spectrum.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm still developing it, and I'm developing it in that direction that you're saying, Doru, and I'm struggling a bit with it now because there's more literature I need to read, but that's where I'm heading. And I think that's what will continue. At death, some things will discontinue, like our flesh is going to decompose biologically, but this love that we can cultivate, that will continue. So I'm thinking it in terms of that. Way.
Anyway, but you can talk more about Théâtre Chardin with Ted Peters. So have fun there in Berkeley. Okay, thanks a lot, Hermina. Let's move on. Time flies, but if anyone else would be interested in adding comments or questions to the conversation, please do so in the chat or later if Hermina is still with us.